There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. If you've ever driven into Melbourne from the western suburbs, chances are you may have travelled across the Westgate Bridge, the steel, box-girder, cable-style construction that has had a foot either side of the city's iconic Yarra River as it opens out into Port Phillip Bay since it opened in 1978. The bridge loops up to its high point, where two towers stand, the Australian and Victorian flags atop them. The bridge, some 58 metres above the water. During peak hour, it's packed, bumper to bumper with commuters, either going into or out of the city depending on the time of day. But on the morning of January 29, 2009, it would become the place where one of the country's most horrific murders would take place, in front of hundreds of drivers, in broad daylight. That morning, the Freeman children, 4-year-old Darcey and her two brothers, Ben, who was 6, and little Jack, who was just 2, woke up at their grandparents' beach house in Aireys Inlet, not far from the iconic surf town of Lorne. They'd gone there with their dad for the days prior to the start of the school year, to get away from the city's oppressive heat. But on that late January morning, they had to get to school. It was Darcey's first day. She was super excited to get to the gates where her mum and grandma were waiting to take the pictures most parents have stashed away in their phones to recall the day their little ones stepped foot into big school for that very first time. But Darcey would never arrive. She would never have that first day, because this day would be her last. What Darcey's father did that morning, in front of her now traumatised brothers and hundreds of witnesses, shocked not just Victoria, but the entire country. For those there that day and who witnessed the aftermath of Arthur Phillip Freeman's actions on the Westgate Bridge, they will carry scars that will never heal, while a mum still waits for her baby, who never came home. I'm Claire Murphy, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. And over this month, we're examining 4 separate cases of retaliatory filicide. When Arthur Phillip Freeman pulled his car over at the top of the Westgate Bridge that morning, turning his hazard lights on to let other drivers know, he was reportedly highly stressed. He was late getting the kids to their first day of school and to the handover with their mum. He was also angry over changes to a custody agreement that had been updated just days before. And he was fuming at the system that he felt was stopping him from seeing his kids. Peta Barnes, the children's mum, started to get nervous when the kids didn't appear on the leafy street where the school stood. So she called her ex, only for him to make a threat that still haunts her to this day. Say goodbye to your children. You'll never see them again. What he did next is so unbelievable. Those who have come into contact with the case still can't wrap their heads around how someone could do that to a sweet young girl who willingly jumped into her daddy's arms when he called for her. But as we've been finding out in the course of this month and the focus on retaliatory filicide, the target of these vengeful men is never the real one. They're just a way to punish someone else. Journalist and award-winning author Megan Norris joins us again today to detail this case, which is featured in her book, Look What You Made Me Do, Fathers Who Kill. She joins us now. So Megan, can you describe to us who Arthur Freeman was as a child? What was his background and what was he like growing up?
I think the word is different, and that's sort of gentle. I think he was a misfit. He was a sad, lonely, isolated sort of kid. He had behavioural difficulties, which reading in between the lines, you sort of read that there were difficulties in socially relating to other people, connecting. He had problems forming friendships and social networks, and he had problems relating to other kids. And I think the behavioural problems would very likely have been a result of his inability to engage. Because of that, for a while in his primary school days, he went to a special school for children with behavioural difficulties. And that seemed to help. He was there for quite a while. And then when he returned to mainstream education, his behaviour was different. So he was a target for schoolyard bullies in his teens. And he really became an isolated, sad little loner where he found it difficult to engage. He was left out of things. He actually preferred his own company. So he was quite solitary and he was teased mercilessly. So the kids nicknamed him Adi Dunga, after a sort of bogan TV character created by the comedian Paul Hogan. And they called him Adi Dunga or Adi Monster. And they taunted him and teased him and told him that he smelled and he was an idiot. And that must have been pretty hard for a kid who already feels different and is struggling to engage. So I think that might have explained his withdrawal. But there was an incident as a kid where he was told by the kids to stand on a rock for half an hour. It sticks in my mind, that, because he didn't question it. He just stood on a rock for half an hour. He never complained. He never fought back. He just got angrier. So you can see that anger bubbling through his teens until he starts work. His first job was a computer programmer. He was more than happy tinkering with his computer, playing his computer games, or messing around with his car. A lot of friends said to the police after he preferred spanners to people, because he could lose himself in that. But he started to look different. So by the time he got his first job, he'd lost all the hair on the crown of his head. So he had a big, expansive bald patch on top of his head. And to make it worse, he grew the hair around the sides of his head really, really long, which gave him a sort of caricature look like a mad monk or a nutty professor, which made him stand out from the crowd because he looked eccentric and peculiar. But even then, with his first job, colleagues recalled that he would throw all-nighters playing PlayStation, all night long, playing his computer games. And I think that was how he engaged, through a virtual world. And then he'd go all night and turn up for work at 8 a.m., do his job all day, go home and do it all again. So his life was actually very solitary. So in many ways, I sort of wonder at this relationship, how it ever really got off the ground with Peta Barnes, because he was introduced to her through mutual friends at a big corporation that they both worked for in Melbourne. And it was quite a mismatch, really, when you think about it. But friends sort of took the view that she was very outgoing and adventurous, and she brought him out of his shell. And sort of he had a social life and friendship circle vicariously through Peter, who was very sociable. He got himself a haircut, he dressed himself up a bit, and he transformed from Adi Dunga, or Adi Monster, into Darcey Freeman, the sort of computer geek and yuppie. He became a bit of a yuppie.
It also seems like, in reading some of these stories, that what these men see in a lot of these women is the ability to break that social barrier that they've struggled with. So these women are outgoing, they find it easier to interact with others, so they kind of piggyback off that to become more social themselves. But then when they do, they end up being jealous of that interaction in the first place. It's an interesting sort of cycle to find yourself in. But despite their differences, they do fall in love. They get married. They're one of the millennium couples who marry New Year's Eve 1999 into the new millennium. What's their relationship like in the beginning there? Because they head overseas pretty quickly after that, don't they?
They do. It seems to be quite sort of a regular relationship. It starts off okay. They were both busy in their jobs. They both had good jobs in London. They got a social scene through their work. They were mixing with people. He probably had a better life socially than he'd ever had in his life. He sort of had arrived. He reached a point where he'd actually arrived. He was doing all these things and they were rewarding, and he was getting on at work, getting ahead, and so was his wife. And it was all going very well until children were introduced into the mix.
So Peter and Artie's children are all born in the UK in quite quick succession. But Peter decides at some stage she would rather raise them back in Australia under the Australian education system. And she also wants to be close to her family. How did the now sort of more social, better groomed Darcey Freeman take this news?
Really badly. And you can understand why he would have. Because in England, together, married as a couple now. They were both upwardly mobile people, both had got good jobs, and he developed a wider friendship circle, a social network. He was going bike riding, playing tennis after work, even going down the pub for a few drinks after work with his colleagues. He went on a skiing holiday. He sort of arrived. It's like the Darcey Freeman of the past had gone, and this new persona had finally arrived and was enjoying a real life. So when his wife announced she wanted to come back to Australia because of the children's education and family connections, he was devastated. He was very unhappy. He complained about it bitterly, and he did not want to come back. But she was really quite insistent, and they decided they would come back, where then he lost all of that networking that he'd established and became a stay-at-home dad. She got a job more easily. He struggled. He became the stay-at-home dad that took Darcey to ballet, took the boys to soccer, read them bedtime stories, and to all intents and purposes was, to outsiders, whether that was actually true in the home, I don't know, but to outsiders, he became quite a doting, or at least his colleagues and lawyers thought he was a doting, attentive father who did everything a father could do. But quietly, he was becoming very, very resentful and very, very angry towards his wife.
So does he get physically violent with Peta? Does he get verbally violent with her? How does that relationship start to go downhill?
Well, he is abusive. He's angry all the time. He's got a short fuse. He's getting impatient with the kids. She decides that the relationship isn't going anywhere. I think probably never would have. I think that time in London was probably the happiest time they had. But coming back, it wasn't working. It just clearly wasn't working, and she didn't want to pursue that. And she decides she wants to end the relationship. And that's when he starts to turn very nasty and very bitter. And there was a scene, I think, once where after they'd separated, where she'd gone around to the house and he grabbed the baby. Like, a lot of people wouldn't do that. They wouldn't think of doing that. And he snatched the child in an argument, and it appeared that he might throw the baby against the fireplace. And I'm pretty certain that there was a physical altercation where Peta Barnes had to fight back to get the child off him and leave the house.
Right before this, though, before that altercation happens, Peta goes to see her doctor, and she admits to the doctor that she feels like Freeman could hurt her or the children.
Yes, she did. She raised that flag twice with two different doctors, where she expressed the fear that he was so angry and resentful that she felt he could do something to the children to punish her. And that fear was expressed on a couple of occasions. But by then, they'd got a number of agencies involved with them. So, the police had been called. It was assumed by the GP that there were enough external agencies involved with them, including lawyers at the time going through a separation, that there would be enough of a safety net in place that they didn't really need to get involved.
So despite mandatory reporting laws, they never said anything?
No, they didn't, on both their parts. That certainly was raised at the inquest much later on. But mandatory reporting to me means mandatory reporting, no matter what you think, no matter how many agencies are involved. It is irrelevant. If the law says you must report it, you must report it. And they failed to do so. So they did fail the family. But the reason being that they thought there was enough safeguards in place that other people were dealing with it already.
What is Freeman telling people while all of this is happening? How does he see himself and his behaviour in all of this? Does he take any responsibility for the fact that agencies are involved in his separation?
No, that was the theme in all the other cases too. All of the men are self-entitled, what they call self-righteous, self-entitled offenders. So it's never their fault. Hence the title of the book, Look What You Made Me Do, which was said by one of the fathers. There were all those sorts of comments were made by each one of those fathers, all very similar, all blaming comments. It's your fault. If you hadn't made me angry, I wouldn't have done that. Why do you want to make me so angry that I do these things? Total blame. And no insight into their own unravelling behaviour, if you like. And in Freeman's case, I believe it was slowly unravelling behaviour.
So in the days and weeks leading up to that day in late January, he's interacting with his friends and family members. Does he do or say anything that make them worried that he might do something?
He was absolutely obsessive about the shared care, and they were sharing care for a while. So when they first separated, the care of the children was shared. So each parent would have the children 3 days a week, 1 week, and 4 the next, alternately. You know, they took in turns, and there was a changeover at McDonald's in Kew. So they had it sort of worked out. But he was unravelling, and she was becoming concerned by his behaviour, as were other people. He was so obsessed, it was the only thing he talked about. So he was constantly calling a former friend in London, who was an expat Aussie. He was constantly calling her, complaining about the injustice of it all, how unfairly treated he was, basically being a victim. You know, he was being victimised. It wasn't fair. His wife didn't want him to have the shared care of the children, but he'd been the one at home looking after them, and now he wasn't getting to do that. So there was a lot of resentment building there. It was a constant source of conversation because, you know, he was grizzling and complaining about it all the time. So you've got this scene, and I think it was heating up where he was getting angrier and angrier about this dispute that they got over the children. And basically he made a throwaway comment that, you know, if he didn't get what he wanted in relation to the shared care, she could look out. Those are the kinds of words he used, you know, they're very vague words, but it was a veiled threat. And at the time, they just thought it was just an escalation of his constant complaining. It was a constant sort of, I'm not getting my own way, oh, she'll be sorry. And no one paid too much attention to it. But with hindsight afterwards, you know, a lot of those people felt, certainly one in particular, a relative, if only he'd have paid more attention to that comment.
What is his behaviour like in the aftermath of the actual separation?
Well, he refused to accept it. So they divorced in 2007, but he refused to accept that it was over. Even after the divorce, he refused to take his wedding ring off, and he became very angry and very resentful about everything. He started to unravel after that. I suspect that he got some of his strength from his wife's strength. That sort of rubbed off on him, and he was sort of now defined as a husband and a father and part of a family. And suddenly he's that loner again, the one he thought he'd left behind. That's how I read it, that he'd become that solitary figure all over again. Very resentful, constantly complaining to family and friends, constantly making telephone calls to the UK, and clearly starting to unravel. His flat in Hawthorne was a cluttered mess of chaos. His own father said that going there, you could see how it sort of was an outward reflection, a tangible reflection of the state of his mind. It was chaotic and cluttered and random, you know. He was collecting things like washing machine parts. He had them everywhere. He started to collect receipts rather, to do with the expenditure on the children and other expenditure. He became very resentful that he was losing out money-wise. He thought that his wife was coming off with a better deal than he was, that she transferred money out of the bank that he didn't want her to have. And he started to count the pennies that he complained he would be left with nothing. So he was collecting receipts, every little receipt to do with expenditure. And I think that in a lot of ways is a way of reclaiming a bit of control, where you can see it on paper in order, all noted and written down. It's almost trying to regain control of a life that feels totally outside your own control.
So as you already mentioned, there was that altercation with Freeman and Peta at his home where her mother was with them, and they believed that he was going to hurt the baby by throwing the baby into the fireplace. So police are called, and the subsequent fallout from that is that the custody arrangement changes again. How does Freeman feel when he's told he's going to have less access to his children?
Well, that's interesting because it was mutually agreed and accepted. You know, this is not where he was told, right, this is how it's going to unfold and this is the go. You're going to have the children every other fortnight at the weekend and once on the Thursday night, you know, alternate. So he'd have the children fortnightly. Even though he was angry, he didn't seem angry by that. It was an arrangement he agreed to. And Peta Barnes said there was no evidence in the weeks before this, or, you know, the few weeks leading up to this, that he was anything other than happy enough with the arrangement. It seemed to be an arrangement he was happy with. But of course he wasn't.
So a few days later, it's hot in Melbourne this summer, really hot. So Freeman has the children. It's the very end of their summer school holidays. So he takes them out to his parents' beach house on the coast. What do they say his behaviour was like when he was with them at the beach house?
Well, he arrived a couple of days before, so they'd left the city and taken the children down to the beach to escape the heat in the city. It was cooler down at Aries Inlet, which is on the Ocean Road. So they'd taken the kids down there, and he was working. So he was then going to join them, and in the interim, the arrangements were finalised. So he then went down the Great Ocean Road to join the kids, and when he arrived, they said that he appeared to be in a kind of trance, almost zoned out, not quite with the programme, and that was the night he arrived. He seemed to be trance-like. The following day, he seemed utterly distracted. So he was impatient, he was agitated, he was anxious. They didn't quite know what to make of that, but he seemed very anxious. He did things like Peta Barnes rang on the Wednesday evening because Thursday that week was to be the start of the new school year, and it was Darcey's first day at school. She was starting prep at the school in Kew or Hawthorne where they lived, and she was going to be going to the same school as her older brother who was 6. So she was really very, very happy about that and very excited. He'd forgotten her uniform. He'd forgotten her shoes. He was disorganised. He was chaotic. He got up on the morning of the Thursday to take the kids to school, unprepared. So his parents were quite alarmed by this. He seemed agitated, distracted, very anxious. He hadn't made their school lunches. He was running around panicking. And he was bundling the kids into the car, and his father had said to him, they tried to persuade him, his parents, maybe don't go today. Maybe just don't go today. You're not prepared. You haven't got the uniforms ready. You haven't made the children's lunches. Do you really have to go today? And it was, yes, I got to go. It's Darcey's first day at school. And he went off in that frame of mind. On that day, his thoughts were not about Darcey's first day at school. His thoughts that morning were about how unfair this arrangement was. So he'd got up still smarting about this arrangement at 6 a.m. and had immediately called his friend Elizabeth Lamb, who was a friend in London, to complain about it. So he called her and couldn't get hold of her at 6 a.m. Then he called again and again. And I think by the time she last spoke to him, he'd actually rung her 9 times. He did manage to get hold of her, and he was just ranting on about how unfair everything was, how unfairly he'd been treated, how Dad's got the raw end of the stick. He was really carrying on. His thoughts weren't about getting his children to school. His focus was completely somewhere else. I think he rang his sister as well, and he sounded quite distracted. He was pestering about he hadn't got the kids' school lunches ready and all of that kind of thing. So I see that being like a pressure cooker building.
So part of that pressure cooker too is that he hits the Westgate Bridge in peak hour Melbourne traffic, which is never a fun experience for anyone. So he's crawling up the bridge. He's in this state of mind where he's angry about custody. He's stressed about the traffic. He's annoyed because of the school lunches and because of the uniform not being there. He's running late. He gets to the top of the Westgate Bridge. What happens?
Well, he's angry by then. And he gets to the top of the Westgate Bridge where he pulls over and puts his hazard lights on. Now, that's not a man out of control. There's things, I looked at that scenario. He pulled over and put his hazard lights on to warn other people. That takes forethought. He thought about safety when he did that. He then telephoned Peter, who was waiting at the school. He was running late, and she and her mother were waiting outside the primary school where Darcey and the older brother were to return to school. So Darcey was her first day, and Mum wanted to take photos, and, it was a special day. It was a big day. And they were worried, where is he? And they rang, and he said, say goodbye to your children. You're never going to see them again. Now, that shows an intent. And what was interesting about it is he didn't say goodbye to Darcey. You're never going to see her again. Or say goodbye to your daughter. He said, say goodbye to your children. You're never going to see them again.
So there's people stopped around him on the bridge. He gets out and goes around to the front seat, but on the passenger side. What's he doing? What does the older brother tell police actually happened inside the car?
Well, he called to Darcey to come with him. And it's interesting, isn't it? She was the one of the 3 children that looked most like him physically. She really resembled her dad. He loved his little girl, or said he did. And he called her, beckoned her from the back seat, her seat strapped in the back, to the front, to come out of the car with him. And the kids were not sure. I think the older brother was not sure what he was doing. But he said, come with me. And Darcey did what Dad said. But he lifted her out of the car, carried her to the edge of the bridge, and just lifted her over the edge and let her go, in full view of shocked motorists who were thinking, what's he doing? And people were not paying that close attention to begin with, but by the time he reached the edge of the bridge, they were. And one woman said to her husband in a car behind them, is that a mannequin?
Did anybody get out of their cars and confront him?
No, but there was a lot of shock in the cars around then. Did you just see that? Did you see what I saw? What did he drop there? Was that a doll? Was it a dummy, a mannequin? Was it a child? I think someone said it looked like it might have been a child. They were very, very shocked. And he just calmly walked back to the car, got back in the car, turned the hazard lights off, and drove through the busiest traffic right into the heart of the city, which is such a busy route from the Westgate Bridge. No, he managed to have the common sense or the presence of mind to be able to drive that car with his other two children in the back. And the little boy in the back, the older brother, said, Dad, turn around and go back. You know Darcey can't swim. And he didn't answer, and he just carried on driving. And he drove all the way into the city, the busiest part of the city, to the court precinct, where he pulled over and went in with the baby, who was about 23 months, and holding the other little boy's hand, took them into a court precinct and handed them over to various staff in there. Now, I think that's quite telling that he did that too, because you almost wonder, he's handed the children's care over to someone else. It's almost like, have them before I do anything else. And that's how I read it. People don't get this. Often, victims of terrible violent crimes are nearly always got PTSD from the terrible event that's happened. But so do offenders. You know, it's not just the victims of those violent crimes. Sometimes the effect of an offender's rage is so huge that having done what they've done, whether it's impulse or whether it's planned, having done it, they go into a state of sort of post-traumatic stress too, you know, shocked by their own rage, the effect of their own rage. I think that happened with him. And when he turned up in the court precinct, he was drooling and dishevelled and crying and just an absolute mess. So I think he went into that sort of catatonic state.
At this point, he's driven away not knowing what has happened to little Darcey. She's just 4 years old. He's just dropped her from the top of a bridge, which at its highest is nearly 60 metres from the top of the water. But people obviously witnessed it and they've called police, and emergency services arrive on scene pretty quickly. One police officer swims out to bring her back to the shore.
So that people were basically out there as fast as they could get. But that really also upset me quite a lot, because the background to that was that you'd got a couple of young constables on foot duty in the local shopping mall, the nearest shopping mall. And they're wandering around. And at that time in the morning, 8:30, 8:45, it was pretty quiet because all the kids had just gone back to school. All the mums and grands were having cups of tea, and there were a few people wandering around. It was quieter than usual. And they get a radio call saying there's been an incident on top of the Westgate Bridge. And they were the nearest to these two policewomen. And they went, OK, we're the nearest, we'll go. So they turn up, not quite sure what the report was about, but they got a bit of information on the way saying someone had dropped a mannequin into the water or thrown a doll or thrown something into the water. They weren't sure what that was till they got to the scene. When they get there, it becomes clear by the time they get there, someone has thrown a child into the water. But there are already other people there, so they've got some of the divers are out there trying to rescue the little girl. And they did actually manage to find her and bring her in, terribly injured. And those two officers, they watched while the paramedics tried to revive Darcey. They went with the ambulance to the hospital and stayed at the hospital. And it was harrowing for them. You know, one of them was a mum. You know, you can imagine, can't you? You know, when you've got kids of your own and they've started school, how terrible that would be. The disbelief, I think, the shock and the disbelief.
So while all this is unfolding, Peta Barnes is still waiting to find out where her children are. She has no idea what's just happened or what's going on. When does she find out the awful thing that's happened to little Darcey, and what happens with her in the hospital?
What happened was Peta was waiting outside the primary school, no show from Darcey Freeman. It must have been horrible for her. She watched all the other children go into school. Darcey's first day, she should have been there bright and early. No uniform, no shoes, no school lunch. He was not prepared. 8:45, she rang Darcey Freeman, who, unknown to her, was on the Westgate Bridge. And again, he wasn't just on the Westgate Bridge. He had pulled over on the highest point of the Westgate Bridge, which again shows intent. Didn't pull over on the approaches, right on the top. So she rings him on the Westgate Bridge and says, "Where are you?" And he says, "Say goodbye to your children," and hung up on her. So she makes 7 or 8 phone calls back, feeling panicked. "Don't know what you mean. What do you mean, say goodbye to your children?" So at that point, she rang her lawyer, still outside the primary school. She rings the lawyer, who says, "Ring the police." So she immediately rings the local police and said, "He's threatening their lives." It sounded like a threat to her. It could be that he meant, "Say goodbye, I'm going to take off with them." That was a possibility, but it didn't sound like that to her. So the police said, "Go home right away. We'll start looking for him. Go home and get some photographs, recent photos." She went in and spoke to the principal first and just explained, went home and got the photos, handed those at the local police station, who told her to go home and wait. Meanwhile, the police are looking all over Melbourne, and no one had made the connection. So where the police arrive at the court precinct, and take him away after he's handed the children over, no one connected that man, the dishevelled man at court, with the perpetrator they were looking for, who all these motorists had been calling about, saying they'd seen him throw a child off the Westgate Bridge. The two were not connected at that point, not until Darcey arrived at the hospital. She was airlifted there by helicopter. That's when they realised. And this guy was then in their sights. But she'd gone home and waited, and her lawyer called her and said he'd just heard the news on the radio that a little girl had been thrown off the Westgate Bridge, and she panicked. And she went straight to the local police station, who escorted her to the hospital where Darcey was. That must have been an absolute horrendous nightmare for that poor, poor woman.
So she rushes down there. What is she confronted with?
Well, Darcey was very, very injured, and she'd fallen from such a height. She had severe head injuries and internal injuries and was on life support. The police officers described that quite well, in their victim impact statements. Normally you wouldn't have victim impact statements from police in a court case, but it affected so many people. There were victim impact statements later from the motorists who'd seen that, who were living with what they'd seen. It was a terrible thing. And so the police stayed there at the hospital, and after a while she realised that Darcey was gone. She was severely brain injured. She'd got, I think they described them as hypoxic brain damage, which from falling from such a great height, you can imagine. And she turned the life support off later that day.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Claire Murphy. I'm speaking with journalist and author Megan Norris about the shocking murder of Darcey Freeman on Melbourne's Westgate Bridge in 2009. What's happening with Freeman in the aftermath of all of this? You've said that he can't be interviewed by police because he's in such a state. What happens in the lead up to him eventually fronting court, and what do his defence put in place as to why he's done what he's done?
Nobody could get too much out of him, and he pleaded not guilty. And the defence's case was basically, was he mad or was he bad? In a nutshell, that's what it became. That's what it boiled down to. The trial turned on those questions. Was he mad or was he bad? Well, he was certainly unravelling. But he knew what he was doing was wrong, and he did it. And I think that was basically the crux of the Crown case. He had the presence of mind to pull over, to put his hazard lights on, to negotiate all that traffic in rush hour. He didn't crash the car. He had the spite or the anger in him to make that call and tell his former wife to say goodbye to her children, which shows intent, that he knew what he was going to do. He was about to do it, and he did it, and he carried it out. Whether he was in a psychotic break or whatever, that became a question for a jury. Was he mentally insane when he did it? Was he out of his mind? Or was he in control of what he did? And did he just do it anyway because he was so angry? And the court decided the latter. Basically, the jury decided that, yes, he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew it was wrong, and he still did it. And his behaviour following that act shows presence of mind also. calmly driving away in the traffic, negotiating the traffic all the way into the city centre, into the CBD, to the court precinct, handing the children over. I think that's quite telling too, because I do believe he was handing the children over before he did anything else. He didn't trust himself, which also shows a certain presence of mind, doesn't it?
Megan, what was Freeman's demeanour like during his trial when he's hearing about that awful day over and over on what happened on top of the Westgate Bridge?
By the time it gets to court, you almost wonder if he's playing up to the audience, because he's doing odd things, like he's baring his teeth at the media cameras waiting outside when the van arrives from prison, baring his teeth and growling like a monster. And he grows his hair even longer and looks like Rasputin, the mad monk. So he sort of was playing that part. I wonder whether was he playing that part to try and add some clout to his case that he was not sane, or whether he was just didn't care, and he just didn't care about himself and didn't care what happened. It's hard to know the difference. Ultimately, the jury were asked that question to determine, is he bad or is he mad? And they determined he knew what he was doing, and it was a deliberately perpetrated crime, coldly executed by a man who knew precisely what he was doing. I think there was some talk amongst the media that once arriving at the court in the van from prison, he'd peeled off all his clothes and he would hold his hands up with handcuffs and shake them in a defiant and aggressive movement at the media, shaking these handcuffed hands and growling at them. Certainly played to the audience.
This discussion around a father who kills mental state right before they do what they do, does it point blame the mother's way in a way, because she's being touted as the reason for his mental decline?
I don't think it does. I was a court reporter. I see it very differently. I see it black and white. I think it's different to someone being under the influence of, not that that's an excuse, but it's different to someone being in the midst of a major psychotic grip, or gripped by some psychotic illness where they don't actually know what they're doing. He knew exactly what he was doing. It makes all the difference. I do think that women carry the blame and the shame. And I think that's part of this crime, though. That's, I think, part of the motivation. It's like, I could kill myself, but why would I bother doing that? You won't suffer for very long. You're moving on with your life. You're quite happy. You've got it all together. You wouldn't miss me for very long, but there's a worse punishment than that. You would miss the kids. And yes, it leaves all of the mothers that I've spoken to say, you leave that blame, that guilt. Why didn't I see that he could have done that? Why didn't I do something differently that could have stopped that? Was it that I left him that caused him to become so angry? But I think in the end it isn't, because lots of people, millions of people separate. They don't all go and kill their kids because of it. The argument that I'm not seeing enough of my kids anymore, my access has been reduced, my time with the kids is reduced, therefore I'll kill them, is completely illogical, isn't it? Why a dad who's seeing less of his children would then want to kill them. That to me makes no sense. And more to the point, in all of these cases, all 9, those children were killed whilst they were in the care of their father. But the blame and the self-reproach, I think it leaves these mothers, one of them said to me, it leaves you questioning your own judgment. How did I lie beside this man, live with this man, bear his children, know him as well as I did, and not know he was capable of this? But in all of these cases, those women did. And Peta Barnes especially raised the flag twice and told her doctors very clearly that she felt that he might be capable of harming the kids to punish her, and he did. So when she's reading those signs and she knows him, and she's reading those signs so early on in the piece and flagging it as a potential for danger, people need to listen and pay attention and respond. I found that in all the cases, it was a general failing of the system overall to, especially in the frontline workers with police and doctors and social workers in lots of cases, failed to appreciate or to actually evaluate the risk properly. And I think that was a general failing. And as a result, that the reports reflect that lack of risk assessment in some cases. One of Freeman's huge beefs was that he had a very unfair report, psychological assessment by a psychologist when he was arguing about whether he was fit to have the kids half the time. He didn't like that report, which cast doubts on his ability to do that. He was a mess. He was not coping. He was chaotic and turned up late for appointments and did all sorts of things. And even in those appointments with the family, it was very obvious to that assessing professional that he had no insight at all into the effect of his behaviour on his kids. That's one of the reasons why she didn't think he should be having shared care, because he wasn't coping.
What's interesting after all of this awfulness is, and we spoke to Michelle Steck herself, who says despite 30 years from her incident with her losing her child in the 1990s, nothing has changed in the system that stops this from happening again. And what's really interesting in this case is it did create change, but not in a way that we would have expected, because $20 million ended up being invested in the bridge in the end.
$20 million were invested in putting up safety railings along the Westgate Bridge. I remember watching them. I lived in Melbourne then, and I would travel over the Westgate Bridge watching these barriers going up, thinking, well, it would stop another dad doing that again. It would also stop other people jumping off and taking their own lives. But they'd just find a different way. That's missing the point for me. That's actually missing the point, because that money would well be spent into early intervention. I think the minute a man is violent with his wife and kids in the way Arthur Freeman was, or the minute they break an intervention order, as many of the men in this book did, they should be put in jail immediately. I think it's a no-brainer. I think anyone who breaks an intervention order is showing no regard for the law. That is just a piece of paper, couldn't care less, should go straight to jail. And I do believe that if the punishments were much, much more severe, as they are with drinking and driving, we're tougher on people who break the rules with drinking and driving than we are with dads who flout intervention orders. And I think if those people were immediately punished severely, a lot of them wouldn't be at large to be throwing kids off bridges or setting them on fire or doing the things they do. But in most cases, those things don't happen. And more upsetting is where you get to the inquest, because a lot of these cases, when I'm writing about them, they're murders. The children are dead and they're before the coroner's courts. And I think that, for me, one of the sad things is where you hear coroners say, this was a crime no one could have predicted. No one could possibly have predicted that he was going to do that. I don't agree. And when I've looked at 9 different cases, there were red flags, lots of, in every single one of them. Those mothers expressed fears and concerns that the children were not safe, and no one paid attention, no one. And that's why I think the book's so important. I thought by taking all these cases and putting them all together, all these women who hadn't been heard, over and over, when you read them one after another, the cases, one crime per chapter, one after another, you can see it happening over and over and over again. All right, the cases are 30 years apart, but the pattern is there, the predictors are there, and in every case they were missed.
Thanks to Megan for her assistance in telling this story. She'll be back next week to take us through another case of retaliatory filicide that shocked Australia, in hopes of shedding light on how the criminal justice system lets women and children down in the worst possible ways. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Claire Murphy. Our executive producer is Gia Moylan, with assistant production by Tahli Blackman. Today's audio design was by Madeline Joannou. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.